If you're ready to unlock more better days, to take control of your health, to push past your limits and unleash your full potential, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Bettel. For over 2 decades, I've worked with elite athletes and high performers, helping them optimize their bodies, strengthen their minds, and recover from setbacks. Now I'm bringing that expertise to you through the Vitality Collective podcast. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the science, strategies, and real-world solutions you can apply right away. Whether it's enhancing your physical performance, avoiding or recovering from injury, sharpening your mental edge, or simply feeling your best every single day. With insights from top experts and thought leaders, this podcast is designed to help you take action, feel better, and live the life that you deserve. Welcome to the Vitality Collective podcast, where every day is vital. Today we're going to do something a little different. You're going to get a front row seat to an actual microbiome consult, live and on the record. I sent Kara Siedman, a registered dietitian and microbiome specialist, my own tiny health stool test results, and we walked through them together. No script, no prep on my end, just the data, the questions, and Kara's interpretation in real time. We cover what the test can and cannot tell you, why a missing bacteria does not mean a broken gut, and what I'm actually going to do differently based on what came back. If you've ever looked at a lab result and wondered what it actually means, this is for you. Let's get into it. Welcome back, everybody. Today, I am so excited. Last time Kara Siedman was on the show, we promised that we were going to do a live and in-person recorded consult on my microbiome. So in an episode that I'm going to title TMI with Dr. Jeremy Bettel, we're going to talk about anything that we need to talk about. So if you don't want to hear about my bowel movements, you should probably skip this episode.
That's what I was gonna say. We're gonna get to know you through your poo.
Yes. Kara, thanks so much for coming back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, me too. So I enjoyed our last conversation so much. Really getting into the nitty gritty of the microbiome. And I think this will be a really good applied, practical, okay, what do we do about it sort of episode once we've got the results. I sort of view this data in the context of all the other data that we collect. My philosophy around human performance as a performance director was always to layer and stack as many data points as we can so that we create overlap and we can actually cluster that data into sort of health categories or injury risk categories where if we see multiple overlaying data points, no one of them is probably really certain like this is the thing. But if we see 5 or 6 different data points that are all pointing in the same direction, it gives us a really good idea that there's something going on and a much more comprehensive overview and an intervention can be created.
Absolutely.
A question I have for you right off the bat as we get into microbiome testing, and again, I'll go back to sport. When we brought accelerometry and GPS into hockey, right, we put these monitors on the guys' pads and we track every movement that they do on the ice. It wasn't even close to ready for hockey, right? It was designed with GPS, so an outdoor sport. Actually, it was designed to track shipping containers going across the ocean. So
very cool.
We figured we could put it on soccer players and see how far they ran, right? And so we brought that indoors with these triaxial accelerometers. And it wasn't even close to ready. We brought it into basketball. But with hockey, there's so much an element of glide where essentially there's no force being applied. You're just sliding along ice, right? So we really had no idea what these numbers meant in the context of hockey. We just knew we were collecting them. So it started out on the we can collect data side of usefulness. And it was nowhere near the, if the machine says this guy's going to get him off the ice, right? So we brought it in right at the early stage of let's gather data and just see what's happening. And it progressed along becoming more and more useful to where it was a helpful part of the ecosystem where all of the different data points complemented by this on ice version of the data started to inform us, but we couldn't ever rely on it on its own.
I think that's...
So that was a very long way to ask.
where are we on that spectrum from we know how to measure bacteria in your poo to like, now we can diagnose with it?
I mean, I think you said it so beautifully. It's a data point. I think stool testing is an exciting area where we've now generated not just a better understanding in general with the microbiome space. And we talked about this, that, the amount of microbiome research that's really evolved in the last 10 years is profound. And we are thinking about the microbiome now as this sort of next frontier when it comes to health and wellness. And there's a lot of opportunity there because it truly is this central hub of communication. And there's definitely been a lag early on from the technology development. But since then, we've developed new technologies that are better able to, as I like to say, intimately and intricately understand not just, who is in the microbiome, but what are they doing? And I think it offers an exciting area for patients, consumers, but also clinicians to get another data point in the ecosystem of what we're looking at. And we use that term a lot, ecosystem, and that is exactly what the microbiome is. But I also think that and I've noticed this a lot throughout my career, working clinically, working in the microbiome space, is that we, similarly to other data points, we really want to know, well, if you have this or you don't have this, it equals this. And it's just not as simple as that, right? We don't diagnose based on microbes. And the idea is, and the hope is can we use this data, can we use this understanding to potentially give us insight into what changes are potentially happening that are going down certain pathways that are more related to certain conditions that have been mapped and we understand that, or also what are the things we need to do to maintain the health of the microbiome so that we're more resilient against, we talked about it last time, the exposome, our diet changes, our travel, our stress, like all the external inputs that we know can disrupt the microbiome, antibiotics, things like that.
Yeah.
But I think what happens a lot of times as clinicians, and I mean, I can even be guilty of this sometimes, and I like to call it that point and shoot method, where it's like, you don't have this or you have this, so do this. And like everything else, it is an ecosystem, and we have to look at how this ecosystem is working as a whole. And I think that's nuanced in microbiome testing, and I think that takes time. I think that takes a lot of education because the microbiome is still a very new field.
Yeah, and I really like what you're saying there about sort of the directionality of the data.
Yep.
We could never look at our, say, preseason testing, right? And think that was going to be relevant in February after we played 50 games.
Yeah.
We had to test and then monitor.
Yep.
With interventions along the way that became very bespoke and it was a lot of tweaking. We were fine tuning the dials as we went through the season, or in a very dynamic manner. And what each guy needed varied based on all of these different factors. So I think that's another important piece, whether it's your blood work or any other biometric or your microbiome. We need a serial
longitudinal data, right? I think that's something to be said in healthcare in general, right? Is what is the direct result of potential interventions or changes? And the microbiome, like other things, is malleable. It's changing. It's constantly evolving. And we can create these sort of new stable communities with a lot of intention and a lot of work. But one test or one point isn't indicative of X performance or X condition. And I think that's something I can appreciate about the functional field of medicine, is that we are trying to gather more longitudinal data to gain a greater or a better picture of someone's health or where their health is leading. And I think that, we talked about this last time, like, unfortunately comes with a lot of cost, and hopefully this is something that becomes more accessible. But I do think that's a big takeaway is, one stool test or one lab result or one, marker, one point of data isn't going to be the end all be all, but it can help guide our interventions and guide the things that we need to make adjustments to.
Yeah. And I think that is such a good point around the cost. I'm in a privileged position where I'm able to do this test. My purpose in sharing it is to really link it to outcomes and have people maybe recognize something they might be experiencing in their body and their health, and be able to track back to, okay, well, maybe do this about it. Right. It might not always be necessary to do the specific testing if you don't have the resources or you don't have somebody to consult with over it. But its outcomes and how do we change and move levers there. So I think that
Absolutely.
it'll be useful to look at the data and help, people might be able to see themselves in what I reveal about my health today.
And what your poo is telling us, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, and being English, this is taking 23 years of becoming an American to like openly talk about poo. It's not
You
something
know,
we discuss in England.
I can't speak for myself. I'm a pretty open person, but working in gastroenterology health and working in GI health for, more than 10 years, it's definitely not something I'm shy about. In fact, a
Yeah.
little personal story here. My husband heard me say this. He'd probably kill me. But I basically told him, I'm like, listen, if you can't poo with the door open, if you can't be around me, then we're not going to make it, because like there are no closed doors here. And we are avid campers and we're out there in the
Yeah.
woods and
Yeah.
hikers. And so got to get a little personal. But yeah, in the GI space, I mean, the amount of patients that it took definitely some trust building to talk intimately about our GI issues. And I think that all of, fun aside, more than 70% of the population, goes more than 6 months or more without discussing GI issues. I think because it is so personal, I think because it's a little taboo, and it is a very common thing, and it is a very telling thing what happens in our poo. And so this is an open space. This is a safe space, and our bowel movements do tell a lot about our health. And now with these types of stool tests, we get to look deeper into those bowel movements.
Yeah, I hope this does give people a bit more permission to go and talk to the doctor, because it's an embarrassing topic, and I know men in general avoid conversations around their health. Tend to be a bit more stoic and guarded about it, but this is something that you should talk to people about, right? Because it is an indication of what's going on in your body, and so we'll have this conversation today, and hopefully somebody recognizes something in themselves, like, oh wait, other people experience this, not that's not normal. And that's certainly the case with some stuff that I've experienced over my life. So
awesome. Well, yeah, let's jump in, right?
So this episode may be best viewed on YouTube, so feel free to listen. But we're actually going to share my test on screen. What I'd like you to describe to us first, Kara, is I use a company called Tiny Health, who neither of us are affiliated with, but I like their test. What methodology are they using, and why is that important?
Yeah, I think that's a great start to it. There's a lot of different stool testing companies out there. And again, this is a very unbiased episode as far as, what test. This is the one that you chose, but the technology is different across the board. We have older technology in stool testing, something called 16S. And not to get too deep into the science, but all bacteria have this 16S gene. 16S technology was one of the earliest technology, I say, more than 40 years ago. But it's using the same technology. So I always like to equate it to think about a cell phone. How many different iterations of the iPhone do we have now? And so 16S, the way I simplify it is, let's say I took a picture of your face, Jeremy, and I cut it up into pieces, and I put those pieces on a wall, and I kind of blew up a few of those pieces. I may be able to tell that, you have darker eyes, that you have a beard, so I can tell that maybe you're male, and that you have, brown eyes and you have brownish hair, but I might not be able to tell that it's you in particular, right? Maybe I can deduce, right? There's been newer technology that's entered into the microbiome space as technology has developed. And I will say there are pros and cons to all. But what Tiny Health is using, and there are some other companies using this as well, is what's called whole genome sequencing. So basically taking a picture of you and putting it up on the wall so we know exactly who we're working with. And what this means in the stool testing world is that you get a more granular view of the microbiome, meaning you not only can see who is in the microbiome, meaning which bacteria, which specific taxa are present, which species, which strains, but you can also see the functions. And I think that is a really important piece, because it's not always about who is there, but is your microbiome functioning the way it should? Meaning, is it carrying out these very necessary, and that's what we're going to kind of walk through, but is your microbiome carrying out these very necessary functions that are indicative of health and wellness and immune system and brain health and all of the things that we
Right.
know the microbiome is connected to. And I think that offers a really exciting opportunity when we look at the ecosystem, when we look at the microbiome as a whole, to step away from this idea of replacing what's missing, killing what's potentially there, to, well, how is my microbiome functioning as an ecosystem?
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have certain, beneficial players or key players there, but I actually have really good functions. And so now the question that's being looked at in research is, well, what does that mean? And we'll get into some of the research because there actually has been some really cool new studies that have just been published this past year that are trying to get closer to identifying what a healthy microbiome looks like.
Of those function pieces. So, we've
Yep.
got the genes. What are they? But how are we measuring what they're doing?
Yep. So this is well beyond my, understanding and education, but it's through a process called shotgun metagenomic sequencing. And so
Right.
basically we're getting raw DNA data. It's very, very cool. And we have what's called, bioinformatics, people who specialize in interpreting this data. And it's then put into these different pathways that have been developed through years of research, but basically being able to interpret this data against these functional pathways that have been identified through research, through other microbiome tests, through all the information that is available out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
So it's very cool when you get the raw input from a stool test. It's just a bunch of DNA and it means nothing.
Right. Yeah, right. That's crazy, isn't it?
It is actually. And these are very smart people. These are very, very smart people that are able
Right.
to interpret this and be able to then translate it into an actionable, actually takeaway piece of information.
Right. Okay, so on that note, if you want to share my report, we'll
Yes.
pull it up on the screen now. And my first question for you,
Yes.
I sent this to you ahead of time, not knowing anything about what I'm presenting with.
Exactly.
What would you expect who would you expect to walk through the door based on this report? Are there any presentations or is there anything that really stands out that you're like, oh, that's interesting?
So that's such a good question. And actually one of my most fun things I love doing is interpreting stool tests, not knowing anything about the person behind it, because I want to see if I can get close to who I'm actually looking at, right?
Yeah.
It's always a challenge I like to do. So without knowing anything about you, because of course I have questions based on the test about you.
Yeah.
But without knowing anything about you, I actually, you have a very healthy microbiome.
Okay, good.
Yeah, really, really good. So you are someone that I would really take away as being generally healthy, not suffering from any digestive conditions or disorders, not dealing with any metabolic issues. I'll explain this as we go through it. I assume from your test that you prioritize and eat a fairly high protein diet. And remember, I don't know anything about you, but that is something that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about why I'm taking that away. You prioritize protein. But you have a very, very good balance. I would assume that you have some diversity in your diet, that you do emphasize certain fibers and try to encourage fiber. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that is a big takeaway, that you have a fairly strong immune system, that you're not dealing with any daily conditions, that you're not having anything that's kind of blaringly getting in the way of your day-to-day life and your day-to-day living. So normally in my typical consults, I would have a little bit of background information, but let's just say you kind of walked off the street and you're like, hey, Kara, I got this stool test. Tell me what you know. So I guess my first question for you, because I don't even know this about you, Jeremy, and I feel like we're old friends now. How old are you?
44.
Okay. And I guess my biggest question is working through kind of systems. So thinking head to toe. Is there anything that you feel like you are noticing day to day in your life? From fatigue to brain fog to GI symptoms, walking through kind of what we would consider maybe a problem.
Yeah. So I would not rate my energy as great.
Okay.
Right. It's something that I've done sleep studies and all sorts of stuff to just wonder why a lot of the time I just don't feel very well rested.
Okay. That's good. We're going to talk about that. There is something there on your test that I noticed. So,
brain function is pretty good. Um, the biggest thing, or one of the main reasons I did this, is because I will have 10 plus bowel movements a day. So we're going to
Really?
jump right into TMI.
I know, I wasn't even down in the digestive tract yet, so okay.
Right. So that's sort of the biggest thing. It's one of the reasons I did this. My blood work's fine.
Mm-hmm.
My diet is pretty good. And if we're talking about Bristol stool charts,
Yep.
we'll get up to like a 6. So it's not diarrhea, but it's not, solid.
So I'm going to put my GI hat on since I've worked so long in GI care. Are you noticing, outside of just the frequency of bowel movements, are you noticing any bloating, any more gas than typical, any upper digestive distress, like any heartburn, reflux, nausea, anything outside of just the bowel movements?
Not dramatically. And there will be times when I feel bloated and I'll get really uncomfortable, but it's really hard to put my finger on what it was that caused that.
Yeah, you're not alone in that, and I think most people don't even realize that food can affect us anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to 3 days later, which is why bloating is a very obscure symptom. The time of day that we're bloated is very telling. So when you have noticed some of this bloating, do you notice it more in the morning or as the day goes on?
Probably as the day goes on.
Okay.
And infrequently, right? So it's not an every day at 2:00 I just feel really gross. So it will change day to day.
Okay, let me get a little bit more intimate into your bowel movement situation here. So you're noticing 10 plus bowel movements a day. Is it all throughout the day? Do you notice your bowel movements being like, so here's the way I would often explain it to someone, like you sit down, you go, you get up, and like 10 minutes later, you're like, oh, I need to go again.
I joke with Michelle that it's like I have a strict 1 in, 1 out policy. Like if I eat something, like I've got to go 10 minutes later.
Okay.
And it might be a similar thing to where like I'll go and come back to the desk and I've got to go again.
Okay. So are you noticing, and I'm gonna explain, especially for any clinician listening, and I teach this to a lot of GI dietitians or practitioners that I've worked with, and how we poop, not just from a Bristol, but from a pattern standpoint, can be indicative of other things or can give insight into other things. And so one thing I'm curious about, few questions. Do you notice, like, after your first bowel movement of the day, like maybe you get up, you walk around, you have coffee, we eat something, and that triggers it, which is super normal, right? Like, especially in the morning. I have to explain this to my daughter a little bit because she's 3 and she'll wake up and she'll toot. And she's like, why do I toot in the morning? And it's like, well, everything's kind of waking up. Everything's getting started. And so things are starting to move through. And she's like, oh. Do you notice, like, after that first bowel movement, are things, does it feel incomplete? Like, are you like, yeah, I definitely didn't get this all out?
Yeah. So I'll get up right away and go. And then I'll get up and move around. Maybe I'll have breakfast. Maybe I'll have a cacao drink or something. And then I'll have to go again. But I know that first one is just like the first one.
Yeah. Does your poops ever come out like thin or pencil-like looking? Okay. Do you, you're like, what? You're like, all right, Kara, you're getting to know me already.
Yeah, we're going to be great friends after this.
Have you ever had any back injury, tailbone injuries? Have you ever hurt yourself?
Yes. Much younger would be tailbone injuries, like back in the days where you go roller skating and, someone would think it was funny to take your feet out and you land on your tailbone. So a couple of those as a kid, but nothing where like it was a disc,
nothing that was like
entrapment that just put me down on the ground. Never really hurt back. Just maybe some musculoskeletal facet type strains, but nothing nerve related.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
And then outside of the bowel movements, any urinary issues like frequent urination, any incomplete urination?
Yeah, I feel like again, a frequency, like an urgency, and that might be like I pee, and by the time I'm back to the couch to finish watching the movie, I need to go pee again.
Yeah.
And particularly when I get in bed,
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I might not go that frequently throughout the day, but
Mm-hmm.
then the first like 3 hours when I'm laying in bed, it's like I got to get up every 10 minutes.
Okay. There may be a connection there. So I say I'm putting my GI hat on, not just the microbiome hat.
Yeah.
Because again, I think what is very telling and what we should know when we're dealing with any type of gastrointestinal presentation, which like 10 plus bowel movements a day is, right? I think this question of what's normal, I always say anywhere from 1 to 3 bowel movements, but if you're someone who goes every other day and it's complete, it's good, it's empty, like who's to say that's not normal? I think we have these constructs of what normal is and normal is, but we have things that we know are definitely outside of normal and that become impactful. And I say anything that impacts our day-to-day living or that becomes problematic to us is something we can potentially look at and improve upon.
Right.
Awesome. Anything else like joint pain? Anything else outside of like?
No, joints are pretty good. Surprisingly, after 15 or so years of rugby,
Right.
my cardiovascular fitness, I feel should be better.
Okay.
My aerobic fitness, my aerobic capacity. Given the work that I've done throughout my life
Yeah.
in that area, I just feel like I should find running easier.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear that. Awesome. Let me just work through my questions here. I think that's great. The 10 plus bowel movements a day, was this a sudden change or has this been like fairly consistent kind of in your adult life? I think you being a rugby player is actually a good piece of information.
Yeah, I think it's been getting worse.
Okay.
I would say this year, but it's never been. I've never been like a once a day kind of person.
Mm-hmm. And then like stress and all of that, would you say on like a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate? I mean, listen, everyone's got stress. And I
Yeah,
always kind of joke when people are like, we need to, remove the stress. It's more about how we cope. But how would you say stress
yeah.
impacts you?
Tremendous amount of anxiety,
Okay.
and that for the last 3 years. So I got out of sport probably 3-4 years ago, and getting out of the safety net of a regular paycheck, building our own
Yes.
business, has
Okay.
been tremendously stressful over the last,
Yeah.
like I said, 3 years. And
Okay.
that's been pretty relentless.
Okay.
With some let up, I would say, in the last 6 months, we've really started to gain some traction where things have been less stressful, particularly financially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where a lot of my stress and anxiety comes in, is with our financial well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where this seems to have accelerated.
That was going to be
So
my next. That was going to be
yeah,
my next question. You didn't see things calm down after that.
no, if anything, it's worse here.
Okay. And then final thing, and we'll just jump right into it so I don't waste too much time, although you can tell I like my questions. From a supplement standpoint, and you don't necessarily have to give brand names of anything, but I'm just curious, what do you take for supplements?
So I'd actually cut back quite significantly. So a protein powder most days, a whey protein. We try and eat organic, and the protein powders we use are organic. I'll take a vitamin D supplement, a fish oil supplement. I use a liquid fish oil. Those are probably the most consistent. And I was taking a pendulum, an Akkermansia probiotic. I'd actually forgotten to stop taking it when I took this test.
And your vitamin D, is that a D3 with K2? Is it just D3?
It's D3.
Okay, perfect.
And it's about 5,000 IU.
Uh-huh. And then just kind of from like a generalization standpoint, so we don't waste too much time, although as a dietitian, I do spend more time on this. Diet-wise, would you say you eat a more diverse diet? Like, is there any kind of diet prescription or plan that you're following? Give me an idea of, outside of just organic and trying to eat whole foods based. Is there anything you avoid?
You were right in that we prioritize protein. I try and bucket my diet into total calories, protein, fiber. And if I get those three pretty aligned, I assume everything else is sort of falling into place.
Great.
So
I like that.
we eat a diversity of vegetables. We cook most everything at home. We do get into a bit of a rut with the same sort of foods, but we're pretty varied. We're less restrictive now with our diet than we have been. We have been guilty of following some of the pendulum swings and been, super like there are good foods and bad foods. So we're a little less like that now. We're much more diverse in our diet in terms of having treats and things like that. So
very good. Awesome. Well, this is all really good information. And so I think what I'll do is kind of walk through the test, kind of give more of like a broad scope, give some insights, and then at the end, kind of give you my interpretation intervention plan. And that's what I would typically do with my patients. So one thing I like about Tiny Health's test and some other tests that do this as well is they sort of give this like overview of a summary, right? This like sort of like if you were to take like just a flash of like how do we rate your microbiome, yours is very good, right? You see that you're kind of above that normal. And I think it's very common to see that, which is good. I was just actually interpreting a test for a patient the other day and, they were like way over here in this. Way over here. And so there was a lot of things that we had to dig through in there. And so I think that's really good. I think that's why like from a takeaway standpoint, like we want to see above average or average and above, because it means that in general, like the things you're doing and the things that you've incorporated in your life are working towards you. And generally speaking, when I look at this summary score, the higher we are, the more resilient our microbiome. And that's a big takeaway from a microbiome standpoint in general. I think I said this on the earlier podcast, but I view the microbiome similar to the foundation of a home. You can have the biggest home, the most beautiful home. It can have all the bells and whistles you've ever wanted. But if you have cracks in your foundation, well, then when that hurricane comes or that tornado rolls through, your structure is not going to be as resilient. And we're looking for those cracks in the foundation to figure out how to build resiliency so we can be more stable or be more resilient towards conditions and immune system changes and all the things we know the microbiome is linked to, which is just about everything, right? So I just want to preface that. So I always think, in the big scheme of things, especially coming from a practitioner standpoint, it's always good to kind of get this like snapshot of like what needs support, what needs improvement. But I want to say that with a caveat, going back to what I initially said about that point and shoot method, because this is an ecosystem. Because I'll be honest with you, if I just look at this as a whole without really kind of looking at the rest of the test, I would potentially make suggestions that potentially are not necessary, right?
Right.
And so I do want to say that, because from here it can say, oh, wow, you don't have Akkermansia, which, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, like, oh, that means I have poor gut barrier integrity, or, oh my God, look at these different opportunistic or potentially unfriendly bacteria. And so I just want to say, like, use this as just like a simple glance, but let's get into kind of the nitty gritty of the test. So the first thing that I always look at and that we kind of get through here is a detailed breakdown of your beneficial microbes. And I just want to say, like, a lot of people hear the word bacteria and automatically think negative, right? Majority of the microbes within the microbiome are bacteria. And they're like an ecosystem. You've got some good plants, you've got some unfriendly plants that maybe have some more toxins, and we look at it as a whole, right? And so I don't like to necessarily think of, oh, bacteria is bad, or what good versus bad, but what is the relationship? And then when we get further down, what are the functions that are being carried out? Meaning, what are they actually doing in here? So you have really good bifidobacteria. Bifido is kind of a larger species. That's one of our most beneficial. We know it produces lots of short chain fatty acids. So really good there. We're going to talk about this guy because I think Akkermansia is one of those ones that's gotten a lot of press. And obviously, as we are more advanced in our understanding of the microbiome, we've got more companies coming out producing these next generation strains as probiotics. And again, it's more about what's happening. So there's been some newer research that's come out in looking at, Akkermansia's role as being a key part of a healthy microbiome. And it is. We've got these, beneficial bacteria, bifidobacteria, Faecalibacterium presnitzii, right here, that you have a really good, and all these good guys, right? Lactobacilliaceae and all these other Roseburia and all these other key players, which really comes down to short chain fatty acid producing bacteria that are producing compounds that have known benefits in the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of talk that have said, oh, well, you don't have Akkermansia, then you have an unhealthy gut barrier. And for those of you that don't know what Akkermansia is, it's a specific Akkermansia mucinophila, mucin loving. And so it lives kind of within that that sort of initial layer of the mucosal barrier. And it's there to help regenerate mucus being a very important component to a healthy microbiome. But there's a lot of other things that impact the mucosal barrier. And there was a really cool study that just came out and published in 2025 that basically is looking at trying to better understand what a healthy microbiome is. What I really liked about this study is getting a better understanding of when you are missing certain markers or when you have certain bacteria that aren't present, does that actually equate to an unhealthy gut? Because one of the things that we see from your microbiome, and we haven't gotten down to this yet, is that you have really good diversity. We saw that score, meaning you've got lots of different species there. You've got lots of good bacteria. You don't have a lot of inflammatory bacteria or inflammatory markers. No signs of infection, obviously. And then I think that is very consistent. You don't have any GI disease, right? So you have a very well-functioning gut, and we'll get further into that. You've got a lot of anti-inflammatory bacteria here, but a lot of people would look at this all of a sudden and say, oh, you're missing Akkermansia, which means you have an unhealthy mucosal barrier because that bacterium is so important.
Well, and what I thought was really interesting here, and my eye was immediately drawn there, and an alarm bell started going off.
Yep.
Is that I'd forgotten to stop taking my Akkermansia probiotic.
Yeah.
And so I found that particularly interesting, especially as we were going to talk about it, because I would have assumed it might have shown as being artificially healthy because I was actually taking the probiotic.
Well, and I think this just brings into context like misunderstandings around what probiotics actually are.
Right.
I think the general public, clinicians, consumers, we take probiotics because we think we have to seed, right?
Yeah.
No pun intended in the name there, but because we want them to colonize or to take hold. The reality is probiotics are tourists. And the reason we take probiotics is really because we are trying to improve upon a function that's not being carried out. So what does that mean in sort of layman's terms? And this is where I think this type of test is actually really helpful, because as we're going to kind of scroll down, our overall health, right, is about ecosystem stability. And so I'm going to kind of use this as a marker and then say, as we go down, like, well, if you didn't have this, then maybe it would be indicative. But Akkermansia, bifidobacteria, Faecalibacterium presnitzii, right? These can all be helpful, but they're not necessarily a sole prerequisite for gut health. And Akkermansia in particular, because we know that throughout sort of generations, we're sort of losing some of that abundance. And it really comes down to in the context of disease. So you are not someone that has diabetes. You're not someone who has metabolic conditions. And so not having this there isn't necessarily a prerequisite to those, but in the context of having it, then maybe it would be more beneficial, because we know people who suffer from metabolic disease, people who suffer from lung disease, people who have autism and certain cognitive decline, that there are certain microbiome consortiums or microbiome patterns that are associated with those changes. So I think this is giving us a little bit more context into not just isolating microbes and assuming that it's equally correlated to having unhealthy gut characteristics, because as we continue to move through your microbiome, we see that you actually have the presence of a lot of beneficial bacteria. And we haven't gotten into the functions yet. We're just like, who is there? So keep it in mind. So when we look at sort of disruptive microbes, you actually don't have a ton. And we're going to get down to like just for time's sake. And this is kind of going through various types of disruptive microbes. And maybe you have some. And in general, like an ecosystem, think of a rainforest. We've got some frogs that are some of the most poisonous frogs, and we've got plants that are some of the most beneficial plants, but they live together as one and they work together as a well-functioning ecosystem. Because if all of a sudden you remove one of those plants, what happens, right? And so we have to have opportunistic bacteria, right? There's innate competitiveness that happens in the microbiome. And so it's never about having only good or beneficial bacteria. Right. But what I do like to look at is the breakdown. You've got more than 70% beneficial, which is great. I mean, that's really good. We've got lots of guys that are unidentified. This is very common. In fact, there was a study that just got published basically with over 600 species that were unidentified that were associated with a healthy microbiome, right? Like that's very, very common. And you have 1% unfriendly. That's really good because when you start to look at competition, there's always going to be more beneficial there. Whereas if you had more unfriendly bacteria, or your unfriendly bacteria is starting to increase in abundance, that's when you have more of those unfriendly bacteria that can compete for space, compete for food. I think you have a very healthy balance here. I would be worried if there were no unfriendly bacteria there. We got to have some, right? We're an ecosystem. Some people really focus on, oh, you've got some of these unfriendly ones, we need to kill them, right? I think that's a conversation for another day, but this is where we have to start to think of the microbiome as a whole. And are these disruptive or potentially unfriendly ones causing or creating change that's contributing to the things you are suffering from? Potentially not, because you've got so much good going on, right? And that's why I say everything is context dependent. But maybe someone listening is saying, well, you have 10 plus bowel movements a day. Maybe that Enterobacter is contributing to that. We can't say that for sure. And I'm going to talk about what I think is contributing to your 10 bowel movements per day. Now, someone who's a more dysbiotic microbiome, let's kind of take the flip of it where they've got lots of unfriendly bacteria, then yes, we'd have to start to look at, well, what are we going to do to potentially start to create a shift in that? But that's not the case in your microbiome.
This would certainly be how we look at data with injury prevention in athletes and performance optimization. I think we have seen a proliferation, particularly in the NBA, where a single bad metric shows up and that player can't play. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The whole point is you use this to allow them to play. And we're using it as an exclusion criteria rather than looking at the whole picture and saying, no, this is a really strong, robust athlete who lacks ankle dorsiflexion. That doesn't mean he's going to tear his ACL in this game.
No.
So I think that there's some parallels there on this bigger front where we mustn't get too caught up in the very specific elements of it.
No. And I think that's why when we look at it in this kind of like point and shoot sort of modality, why sometimes it can be misleading in determining your clinical correction course or your intervention course. Another big thing to keep in mind is we don't diagnose based on microbes, right? Like, yes, if you have an infection, an acute infection like food poisoning or E. coli or something like that, it's different. But that's not the case here, right? These are generally people that are dealing with either chronic conditions or generally healthy and not necessarily having an acute issue, right? Then we get into other things like parasites and infection, and like all those are good. So I'm going to move on for time's sake, because I think what is the difference between the certain technologies available from whole genome sequencing to these 16S tests that we talked about early on is that with whole genome sequencing, you pull out what the microbiome is actually doing. So let's do a recap. You've got lots of good guys there. You've got lots of bifido and F. faecalibacterium. You don't have Akkermansia. So right away in our mind, we're like, oh, you're missing a key player. What is that doing? And how is my microbiome responding to that? And so when we look at functions of tests, lots of different functions, and many tests are continuing to innovate on these functions. And I think we're only going to see this get broader and more detailed as we start to add these. So one of the things we look at is methane production. Methane is a gas, right, often produced by our archaea. And for many of us who've worked with SIBO patients, so small intestinal bowel overgrowth, or people that have a lot of gas, methane can be a big problem. Yours is fine. Hexa-LPS is a marker looking at lipopolysaccharide, and lipopolysaccharides being a very inflammatory, immunogenic component on our gram-negative bacteria. A lot of us have heard about lipopolysaccharides. It is a marker of gut barrier and inflammation, because the problem is if you have signs of gut barrier breakdown and you've got lots of LPS, lots of pathogenic bacteria, then that LPS, those components can get into circulation and start to wreak havoc throughout the body. And so lipopolysaccharide in the blood is sepsis. That's at very, 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 very high levels for those of us that worked in the hospital. But it is a trigger for low-grade chronic inflammation, and low-grade chronic inflammation that is felt and seen from head to toe. LPS can cross the blood-brain barrier. It can drive changes to our lung, architecture, to liver, all of the above. And so it is something we want to keep in mind of. Now, this I want to point out. This is a mucus degradation index. So your mucosal barrier is that really important, that security perimeter that basically keeps things in the microbiome from getting into your immune system. Remember, what did you have missing? Which bacteria? Akkermansia, right? And Akkermansia is often, touted as a marker of gut barrier integrity.
And I think more importantly, it's recently being touted as the mucose degrader.
Yeah, and there are other ones, right?
When you make a supplement that is Akkermansia, you sort of have to do that.
Yes, but I think this is why functions are important, because look, you have a really, really, really good mucus degradation index, meaning, and you have lower, your LPS is within normal range, all that's fine. You have really good bifido, you have really good FPROL, there are other things, meaning your gut barrier looks intact, meaning it doesn't look like you have a degraded security perimeter. This is where the functions can be helpful, right? Now, if this was off, or this marker was off, and you had other things pointing to LPS, and you had low Akkermansia or not detected Akkermansia, and you had other markers then that could be indicative from a context-dependent standpoint that maybe we should replenish that to get the targeted action of that probiotic. But remember, the goal behind probiotics is not to colonize, it's because you need that targeted action, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I think that's a really important piece. This is where functional analysis is really cool, because we're actually looking at how your microbiome is functioning with who is there. Short-chain fatty acids, which again are sort of those key inflammatory immune support, signals that are good bacteria produce, and you have really good short-chain fatty acid production, which is really cool to see. So reflection of your diet and reflection of those good guys that are there. And I think we forget, going back to kind of the Akkermansia conversation, is that, well, if you don't have Akkermansia, you have poor mucus barrier, but one of the greatest support agents to promoting mucus are your short-chain fatty acids. It's one of their main jobs, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Digestive capacity, meaning your ability to break down certain fibers, is actually pretty good. When we look at some,
what are these sugars that that are flagged as?
So these are just different types of your complex carbohydrates, your prebiotics. So a lot of them, if you think of your fructooligosaccharides, lacto, your xylo, these are your prebiotic fibers. And our prebiotics selectively feed and are selectively utilized by certain bacterium. So isomalto oligosaccharides is a mouthful. There's a little bit of a flag there, and it just might mean, a little less robust amount of those certain types of bacteria that break it down. It can also just point to wanting to diversify your prebiotics a little bit more to make sure that we're giving a good diversity of those prebiotic fibers.
What vegetables might that be present in?
Think of those FODMAP containing foods, from your onions to your garlics, right? To your asparagus and cruciferous vegetables and things like that. Protein breakdown. So this is something called proteolytic fermentation. So as we look through digestion, right, majority of your fibers stay intact up here until they get into the microbiome, into the large intestine, because that's what feeds our bacteria. Mm-hmm. Protein and fat are obviously digested further up in the digestive tract, right? I mean, carbs actually start digestion in the mouth, right? Which is why chewing is so important. It's such an innate piece of digestion that we don't think about so often, because you have that salivary amylase there. Then when we swallow, right, food goes into the stomach, where we have hydrochloric acid. which starts to denature those proteins into your basic amino acids. And then as food gets into your small intestine, then your fat starts getting broken down, your proteins get broken down further. We have digestive enzymes, your disaccharidases that break down your carbohydrates a little bit further. And then anything left that's intact or anything left gets into the large intestine where now our microbes feed on it, which is why complex carbs. So this is telling us that you're having good fiber digestion. So as it gets into the large intestine, that it's there for your microbes to feed on, which is why looking at this like isomalto oligosaccharide, it's not necessarily that you're not eating enough of it. It's just that it's probably staying a little bit more intact and needs to get broken down a little bit further. Now, if we're missing a lot of these, sometimes it points towards digestive enzyme need and certain enzymes. And so it just depends on what comes back. But yes, definitely something that we can talk about in terms of diversification. Protein's an interesting one. And I think it's just like such an important conversation in this like protein focused world. And I'm not even going to get into like the new dietary guidelines and all of that, but obviously proteins become such a focus.
That's why I was really interested in this piece of it, because we're getting hammered right now with,
I know.
Eat your body weight in protein every day.
It is. And it brings up a really valuable conversation around the microbiome's role in protein degradation. Because protein, when protein doesn't get fully broken down, those amino acids in the stomach, then we have larger protein molecules that are there entering into the large intestine where microbes can feed on it. And one of the things that these functional analysis, a test like this can show us is, A, do we have larger protein that's getting into the microbiome? And B, what are those outputs? What does that fermentation look like? Which can be a reflection of maybe some of the unhealthy bacteria there. So knowing that you actually have a really good balance of beneficial bacteria compared to the dysbiotic or more unfriendly bacteria, your ammonia, which is a byproduct of protein breakdown, and even branched chain amino acids, which get talked a lot about in the athlete world, which is actually good, but if we have too much of it, can create imbalance. This makes me just think that you consume a lot of protein and you just have more intact protein getting through digestion because of maybe the abundance that we're consuming. When we're consuming a really high protein diet, and this is kind of a generalization, but I kind of do this for most of my patients that I work with, is when we are consuming a lot more protein, that we probably should use some kind of bitter support. Now, obviously, take each digestive bitters, something to help stimulate a little bit more stomach acid, because again, your body's going to digest what it can at that time. And when we have more intake, then we want to give a little extra support in denaturing those proteins.
An example of what that might be, like these bitters.
Yeah. So obviously we have lots of different bitter herbs that we can consume, but like dandelion. And then there are tinctures, herbal bitters, right? A lot of times we think of them in like the digestif world, but there are various companies that actually have digestive bitters that we can take prior to a meal that stimulate a greater production of hydrochloric acid. And I'm a big proponent of that when we are consuming lots of protein, because it's just more than what our capacity is to potentially break down at one time, which, goes back to even debating this conversation of how much protein we should be eating at a meal versus is it more about what we consume in a 24-hour period, right? And I'm a big proponent of balance. Like I would rather someone eat 30 grams at a meal than try to eat, 10 at a meal and then consume 70 at one meal. That's a lot of protein in one sitting. Where does your digestive capacity actually support that? So I think as we move into a more protein-focused landscape, and we are emphasizing it, that's where some people really do benefit. And because you have a little bit more of this ammonia breakdown, I would probably put you on some digestive support. Now, let me mention this, even though your test isn't showing this, but let's say you had a lot of pathogenic or dysbiotic, unfriendly bacteria, and you're consuming a lot of protein, then a lot of these potential proteolytic or protein byproducts can be a lot higher. And these have a more inflammatory role in the body and can start to wreak more havoc. And so again, everything about the microbiome is Goldilocks. It's all about balance. It's not about having nothing of something, but even like your good bacteria. Like let's say I look at people who have really high Akkermansia on their stool test. It's all about balance, right? Not too much, not too little. Even good guys in high amounts is showing imbalance. And what is that doing? It's having an impact on the ecosystem as a whole. And so then from a functional analysis, we can see some of those things that potentially could be happening, maybe more mucus degradation, maybe more inflammatory markers. And so because you're generally healthy and everything else looks really good balance. That's why my assumption from this was more diet related than inflammation related. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, great.
So many people don't know that, our microbes are responsible for producing key vitamins, certain B vitamins, and in particular, vitamin K. Vitamin K is a very interesting one because there's various types of vitamin K, right? K1, which we know is very predominant in our leafy greens, plays a big role in blood clotting. And then vitamin K2, which is through bacterial fermentation, which is why I asked about your K2 in your supplementation. So when I see that our microbiome is just not as robust, and you're right on the edge there, but when I see that our microbiome is not as robust as at producing vitamin K2, it's definitely, now I'm a big proponent of K2 supplementation in general because we aren't eating or consuming a ton of natto. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried natto. It's fermented soy. It's pretty interesting. Tried it when I was in Japan. It was funky and I like fermented foods. Definitely not something I'm consuming day to day, and that is the highest concentration of K2. So you're someone that I would probably make sure is taking K2 with their vitamin D3, and I'm just a big proponent of that in general. From utilization of making sure calcium is getting to where it needs to get to, but definitely because your microbiome is not as robust in producing that is a very good thing to add. So we'll talk about that. Diversity. Everything is talked about as diversity in the microbiome. We should have lots of diversity. So Shannon index is like the amount of species, and you have a good amount of different types of species, which is why your functions are looking really good. And your overall resilience score, which I love, is good too, meaning that let's say you were to go on antibiotics right now. It doesn't mean you don't need to take something to prevent changes, but remember I talked about foundation, and when that earthquake comes or that hurricane comes, you do have more resiliency. I love this marker here, oral microbes in the gut. When someone has a lot of oral microbes in the gut, what happens when we swallow is things should get basically killed in your stomach acid. So if someone shows a huge presence of oral microbes in the gut, that's a sign of digestive insufficiency. And we know the oral microbiome is a big player in overall health too. And then when I look at metabolites, the metabolome, I really like this because this is also a function. Histamine producing species, we know that histamine is a big player in how we feel and symptom presentation. Beta-glucuronidase, many of us are familiar with beta-glucuronidase. Beta-glucuronidase is an enzyme that basically deconjugates estrogen as estrogen gets dumped into the intestine. So this plays a big role in estrogen metabolism, what we call the estrobolome. Our microbiome is a key player in making sure our hormones stay balanced. What I did find interesting is that you are mentioning sort of decreased energy. And you are a 44-year-old male, and men go through their own hormonal sort of changes. And so this could be something to look into. Just, again, it's not completely out of range or anything like that, but just something to look at as, are your hormones, more indicative of what's happening, from an energy perspective. Your GABA and all that's good. Unconjugated bile acids, I don't get too concerned about, but in the presence of certain diseases like fatty liver disease or certain GI diseases, IBD, then that could be alerting us, to things. And then I thought this one's very fascinating to me always is urolithin, which definitely gets talked a lot about. And there are certain species that we know are urolithin A producers. And this can point back to polyphenols in the diet, certain polyphenols. Or the capacity to produce urolithin. And so you may be someone who, if you are noticing from, an aging and all that would potentially benefit from taking like a urolithin A. And there are various, companies out there doing that.
Yeah, I actually noticed that and just ordered one. I've never taken one before. So I'm interested to see if there's any impact.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested too, just kind of noticing what you had mentioned. And again, it's not necessarily because you have some of those bacteria there, but it just could be like, we don't have some of those abundance of those specific polyphenols in the diet, like how much, of those, polyphenols are we consuming? So just to kind of give like a good takeaway and just kind of like a summary of your test and what I would say, overall, when we're looking at sort of your strengths, right, of your test is you have really good diversity. You have this overall very strong short chain fatty acid producing community within your gut microbiome. which is really important. Meaning you have an anti-inflammatory tone of your microbiome, which is good.
Right.
So instead of the microbiome being oftentimes more inflammatory, which is what drives then dysfunction or dysregulation to other systems of the body, you actually have a strong anti-inflammatory tone. So that's really, really good.
Right.
And because you have this anti-inflammatory tone, you have these strong short-chain fatty acid producing bacteria. That means you have an intact gut barrier. You have a really good integrity to your gut barrier. That security perimeter is strong. Your immune signaling is strong. You have, colonic epithelial health. So your colonocytes, those cells of the colon, appear, very healthy there. You have a species richness that is showing diversity throughout the species. So you don't have an overabundance of one type of species, which could be pushing your microbiome towards functioning a certain way. And you have more than 70% of, your microbes there being beneficial, which is so good. So that's really equating to better resiliency towards potential perturbations like stress and illnesses and chronic travel and diet changes, right? Like why we can be more 80-20, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very protective feature, right?
Yeah.
Especially in someone like you who is fairly asymptomatic. Now, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about your bowel movements. I'm going to get to that. So from a function output, what's working well is that your bacteria that are there are doing the job that they're supposed to do, right? You have a good mix of bacteria that's obviously supporting digestion, promoting a healthy gut lining, which is really key, right? Not having leaky gut, which a lot of people are familiar with. And your microbiome is sending more calm anti-inflammatory signals to the rest of the body, which again, you're not suffering from any chronic disease. And especially when we look at patterns associated with certain disease conditions, you don't have that. Whereas like I ran a test on someone recently and she had, certain markers related towards thyroid disease, and she did suffer from that. And she was going through menopause and her microbiome looked like that. So it was very much following her sort of clinical course of what she was suffering from. It was very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You have, and so your good diversity is important, meaning, it's stable. There's no red flags. And then again, that low Akkermansia or that not detectable Akkermansia, isn't a problem in someone who's lean or normal weight or those that don't have metabolic dysfunction, especially when you have high short chain fatty acid producers here. So it's not a clinical concern. It's not required for you at this point for gut health or other barrier support because your other barrier supporting microbes are there, right? And so I think that's an important piece to take away. We have to look at the person and look at that as a whole. I think ultimately you have so much working for you. Now, what would I change to continue to promote this resiliency and to make sure that our microbiome is supporting us, right? Kind of going back to this precision nature of medicine, nutrition, or even this microbiome world, it's not about replacing microbiomes. It's about supporting these innate functions that keep this overall ecosystem healthy, right? So it's not just chasing a good bug or killing a bad bug, but how are these communities working together? And that's why your functions are pointing to that. So I would continue to promote more diversity in your diet, right? I would continue to make sure that we're getting a robust amount of different types of complex carbohydrates and different types of fibers and, really emphasizing different resistant starches and different vegetables. Because I too am someone who we kind of go towards the same 6 vegetables. So I keep a fiber chart on my refrigerator and every week I pick 2 or 3 different new plant types of foods to add to my diet that I didn't use in a recipe before. I think adding more plant fibers can also, especially in conjunction when we eat protein, helps to slow down that ammonia production. Because we know protein and carbs should be eaten in conjunction. But I also would say when you are emphasizing protein that you are someone that would probably benefit from adding some digestive bitter support just to make sure we're breaking those down, especially because you have a higher amount of those branch chain amino acids. And so again, that can just point towards your digestion of not fully breaking them down because you just have a lot in your diet at one time.
Right.
You again could try a urolithin A supplement. That could be something that could be useful to try, especially as you're aging and your cardiovascular health and your avid exercise. From a supplement standpoint, from a probiotic standpoint, at this point in time, I would emphasize more of the diversity of the diet. Do you need a probiotic? Not necessarily. I think there are probiotics that are good to have kind of once in a while. But again, I think probiotic therapy is moving more towards this precision nature. What are you trying to support? Or what are you dealing with because your microbiome is not being supported? And you don't have that right now, right? I would definitely emphasize like more of the like fermented foods in the diet, just because not from a probiotic standpoint, but because of what those probiotics produce in the microbiome, which are postbiotics.
Sure,
and we know
sure.
those are very beneficial.
What would be some examples
of fermented food?
Yeah.
Kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, yogurts, right? Cottage
Right.
cheese. I'm a huge kimchi fan. I love sauerkraut. We think of miso just for miso soup, but we eat it on, like I buy a really good like whole grain fibrous bread and I'll put miso on that with an egg on top, and add that because it's salty, it's flavorful. I would do a K2 supplement too as well, especially since you are taking vitamin D3. And then my final thought.
Do you like kombucha?
I love kombucha. I think it's great. Yeah. Kombucha, kefir. I think all of that's great. Like I give we drink kefir in our family and I give it to my daughter with her breakfast. It's like a drinkable yogurt. And there's easy ways that we can start making our own yogurt. Because again, even we don't have to make these things, because some of the research that's being done on fermented foods is it's not about getting a sufficient amount of live bacteria. It's those beneficial bacteria that as they die or as they get into the digest, it's what they're producing that's actually creating the beneficial change, those postbiotics.
Right. Gotcha.
And then finally, my last thought, because I have not lost track of your 10 plus bowel movements a day.
Okay, good. I've been waiting.
Because your microbiome is not necessarily pointing towards, now maybe a little bit from a digestive capacity standpoint, because you are someone who overemphasizes protein in the diet. So it could just be an insufficiency from a digestive capacity. So it'd be interesting to see what happens or changes when you add in those digestive bitters when you eat. But remember I asked a little bit about your urinary frequency. So one of the things and this just comes from my experience of working in GI and why I asked about any back injuries. Structurally, there are things happen that can change and impact our digestive tract or our bowels. And it can actually be stemming more from like a pelvic floor standpoint. And actually, this is like right up your alley, right? Pelvic floor dysfunction. And I'm not saying you have this, but this is something I would think about. Because pelvic floor, right, your pelvis sits between, right, your pubic bone, your bowels, your back, right? It's right there. And anytime we've had changes, and actually pelvic floor dysfunction is considered what we used to call functional GI disorder, or now what we consider a disorder of gut-brain interaction, because the signaling of when to relax doesn't always happen versus when to contract. And so I often see signs of like very thin pencil-like looking stools is your pelvic floor is contracting when it shouldn't be, which is why like squatting is such an important position for having very complete bowel movements. You've been a rugby player. You've had trauma potentially to that area that's been compounded over the years. In fact, he would kill me when I use him as an example, but my husband he was a mountain bike racer. And he had a very terrible tailbone injury and probably, maybe broke it, but had severe GI shifts after that and has just dealt with it his whole life. And it's been something that's just, yes, he can, sometimes are worse in times of stress. This can happen. But because you're also noticing some of that urinary, I would be interested for you to explore what's actually happening in your pelvic floor. Because when we have incomplete bowel movements, pencil thin like stools, lots of stress, which interacts with the gut brain, and you didn't notice any of that improving, that maybe the years of all of that, the rugby, that it's all kind of compounded to having a miscommunication between your pelvic floor and having more complete emptying, especially seeing that you have that urinary frequency. So the microbiome is a big part of that, because we want to make sure we're keeping motility, which is why I think the digestive piece could be useful and very helpful. But I actually think your bowel movements it's not necessarily a digestive issue or even a microbiome problem, and could be coming from something completely different.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
This has just been a treasure trove. And I think, we have tons of practitioners who tune in. And I think that for that practitioner community, I just love practical examples of going through a real case study. And so I think this will be really helpful for people.
And I think even a takeaway of like, here's someone who has been actually having a digestive issue, and the microbiome's not 100% reflective of that, although there are some pieces that we've figured out that may actually be helpful, and that we have to think about when we're thinking of health as a whole body and whole system. It's not just an isolated thing to your digestive tract, that all of our systems talk to one another.
Right. Yeah, that's such a key message from today. And I appreciate how you've approached this conversation so much.
So it's fun.
Kara, thanks again so much for coming back and giving us all this time to go through my results.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun.
When we take a relatively new area of science like microbiome research, it can often feel a little bit abstract and we can be a bit disconnected from it. So I thought that was a genuinely useful conversation with Kara Siedman, and it really connected some of the dots and made it a little bit more concrete from the test to what it means to what we can actually do about it. So here are the 3 key things that you can take away from that episode. Number 1, rotate your fiber sources, not just your total fiber amount. Pick 2 or 3 new plant foods each week that you'd not normally reach for. Your microbiome runs on variety. Number 2, if you eat a high-protein diet, consider adding digestive bitters to your meal. When protein intake is high, your stomach needs extra support to break it down before it reaches your large intestine. Bitters can help bridge that gap. Number 3, lean on fermented foods before reaching for a probiotic supplement. Kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, miso. It's what these foods produce inside your gut, those postbiotics, that create the real benefit. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and leave a rating or a review. It makes a real difference in helping us reach more people who could benefit from these conversations. You can stay connected with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Vitality Collective Performance, where we share additional insights, behind-the-scenes content, and updates on upcoming episodes. The information shared in this episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes to your training, recovery, or health practices. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.